In recent decades, a number of serious objections to the just defense theory have arisen. First, in order to judge whether or not the 7 criteria of the just defense theory have been met, access to accurate information about the true intentions, the real reasons political leaders have decided to go to war is required. But as has often been observed, in time of war, the first casualty is the truth. Every nation has become quite expert at spin, the telling of half-truths. In the 21st century, disinformation has become an art form. A second objection to the just defense theory is that, in violation of common sense, every nation is allowed to serve as its own judge. There is no international, neutral third party that can look at the conflict situation and reasonably apply the 7 criteria of the just defense theory. Every nation is left to decide the justice of its own policies, and of course every nation comes to the conclusion that it's the other guy who's at fault. The third objection is that in practice, the just defense theory has rarely been used. The bishops of Nazi Germany did not use it to condemn Germany's wars of aggression. Until the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, no body of Catholic bishops had ever used the just defense theory to condemn its own nation's war. The fourth objection: is the just defense theory a Christian theory at all? Catholic moral teaching accepts and even reveres the role of reason and philosophy in ethical thinking. But this case is a bit odd. In the case of the just defense theory, we have a moral teaching based on Cicero and Plato with no appeal to the teaching and example of Jesus, the scriptures, or Christian tradition. Indeed, it could be argued that the just defense theory actually contradicts Jesus, scripture, and tradition. Even though Jesus never directly condemned abortion, present church teaching does, and this is perfectly consistent with Jesus' life and message. But the just defense theory is different. It seeks moral sanction for something that Jesus himself did condemn, in both word and practice. Fifth, the just defense theory has a serious logical flaw, namely it assumes what it's supposed to prove. The theory is supposed to show that there are occasions when the teaching and example of Jesus, the scriptures, and the early church can be put aside or overridden. But it doesn't. It merely assumes that, and then provides some conditions and limits. The final objection: the just defense theory is a limited war theory, and as such it has little to say to the kind of total war nations now wage. It comes from an era when warfare was limited. Battles were fought only by professional soldiers, not civilian draftees and children, with weapons tame by modern standards, and fighting was waged by appointment on battlefields away from cities and civilians. Civilians often came with picnic lunches to watch the spectacle from nearby hills. The situation today is obviously very different. By the middle of the last century, warfare had become anything but limited. War today tends to be total. Everything and everyone has become a target, and there are staggering consequences as a result. Consider these few examples. During the First World War, at least 12 million people were killed, and at least 10% of those killed were civilians, non-combatants. By the time of the Second World War, thanks to airplanes and tanks, at least 40 million people died, and at least 67% of those killed were civilians. John Terman of MIT has studied the number of civilians killed in our wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq. In his book, The Deaths of Others, The Fate of Civilians in America's Wars, he concludes that between 6 and 7 million non-combatants died in those wars, well over 50% of those killed. These statistics are the most conservative estimates, and they do not include the military personnel killed by the enemy or by their own hand, nor the number of civilians and military left permanently disabled and or psychologically traumatized. Warfare today is no longer limited. War today is total, and the majority of those killed or maimed are civilians. It is hardly honest to call the deaths of non-combatants collateral damage. If any or all of these objections to the just defense theory are valid, we are faced with an unavoidable conclusion that given the nature of our weapons in wars, the theory has become irrelevant for 21st century Catholic Christians. Recall Archbishop Martino's comment that, like capital punishment, war may be theoretically just in principle, but rarely in practice. Since the just defense theory is the only attempt ever to provide an exception to the rule, do not kill, and love your enemies, There is no other option for Christians than gospel nonviolence, Christianity's default position, the original pacifist teaching and practice of Jesus in the early church.